We're going to get started with our backbone of elections training. We're going to talk about election roles in New Hampshire and election workers and their roles and why election workers are so integral in making elections run smoothly. There are various roles to be filled. Some are elected and some are volunteers. Go to the next slide, Arno. If you don't mind putting your name and where you're zooming in from, we'd love to have that in the chat. But I do want to acknowledge that we do our work on Indokina, the homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people, past and present. We honor the waterways and land and the Abenaki, the people who stewarded and Nakida through the generations and continue today. And we're gonna go on. Today's training is brought to you by Open Democracy, whose mission is to achieve an equal voice for all. We're a nonpartisan, non-profit. I do want to thank election workers from Antrim, Derry, Dover, and Franconia for joining us today to share about their roles. Why your service is important as an election worker. Across the country, we've seen election administrators report election workers shortages. One town was missing a pivotal piece 2 weeks before the primary elections here in New Hampshire. Shortages of election workers could lead to longer lines, and studies found that voters are more confident in their election workers when they have really good staff. Election workers are critical to maintaining safe in-person voting in our communities in New Hampshire. And there are a lot of benefits from volunteering as election worker. I know spending the day at the polls really helps me feel really good about my civic duty. I get to meet and catch up with a lot of neighbors and friends that I haven't seen. Knowing that you're helping provide safe, accessible, and secure elections is the bedrock of your democracy. And also, it's really important to understand that actually some of these jobs are not all volunteer jobs. Some communities do provide stipends and compensation for their positions, and that does vary from community to community. And so who can be an election worker? You have to be registered to vote to be an election worker in New Hampshire and 18 years old. I do say that, but there are some exceptions where students who are 17 can be appointed as greeters or other duties for election workers. So there is one exception to that rule. Most of the roles you have to be in the voting district where you are volunteering. Although there are some exceptions to that, and some election worker roles do require a party affiliation because they try to achieve balance in Republicans and Democrats on a table. So we have a wonderful panel here tonight to discuss their roles in their communities, and I'll introduce the panel as we get started. We're going to talk about mostly volunteer roles, greeters, ballot clerks. Sometimes election workers have parking attendants, and then post-election counters, people who come in when polls are closed to count. There's also elected roles, the select person in that area, the moderator, the supervisors of the checklist, and clerks, although clerks are not all elected, some are appointed, and that depends on which community you live in. The greeters, I think the greeters are actually the most important role. They're the first person a voter sees when they come into a polling place, and they can really help voters know if they're new and have to register to send them to the right line. They can have people getting their IDs ready. they're the smile on the face when people come into the polling places. And the greeters really can actually create a positive environment and make people feel welcome to the polling. Also, the ballot counters can help sort of once polls close, help count. Sometimes election workers do that duty as well, and sometimes clerks and moderators will have a new round of people that come in to help count after the polls close. And I'm going to turn it over to Linda from Antrim, who is a ballot inspector or ballot clerk. It's kind of called by two names.
Yes, thank you, Olivia, and welcome everyone. So the ballot clerk basically checks in the voters and records that they've checked in by marking it on the checklist of voters. And they also issue ballots and record issuing those ballots. Because this upcoming election is a primary, voters will get either a Republican or a Democratic ballot. Undeclared voters can choose whether they want to vote in the Republican or the Democratic primary. And that is something that gets specifically recorded if for the undeclared voters, the ballot clerk has the responsibility to write in above undeclared on the checklist which primary the voter voted in. And undeclared voters can change their affiliation back after they vote. So when the voter comes to your table, they have to announce their name and their address, and you look their name up on the checklist. You repeat it back to them and verify that the information is correct. If it's correct, you have to check it off and again repeat the information back to them. And once they have been given a ballot, you also have to, of course, ask for their voter ID, which has to have a photo and their name. The name doesn't have to be exactly as it appears on the checklist, but it should be close enough that it's obviously the same person. I lost my train of thought. Oh, and after you issue the ballot, you also have to draw a pencil line through the last name. So that indicates that the ballot was given. If a name is not on the checklist, you send the person to the supervisor of the checklist. If they have changed their name, they also go back to the supervisor of the checklist. If the address is not correct, then the ballot clerk draws a line through the current address, the old address, writes the new address in red above the address. Let me see what else. And then absentee ballots get recorded as AV, absentee voter, to the left of the check column, and that also gets checked off. If the address is, if it is an address change, as long as it's in the same town or ward, then the ballot clerk can write the new address in red above. If it's not in the same ward or town, the person cannot vote at our polling place. I think that's briefly what you do. And you do have, of course, the state has very specific, in the election manual, there are very specific and detailed instructions as to exactly how you handle each situation. I think, did I leave anything out, Olivia?
No. Thank you. And ballot clerks in your community are paid?
Yes, we are. I was surprised to find that out. And I just have to add, as a retired educator, it's always fun because I get former students coming through to vote, and it's always great to see them. So makes it enjoyable.
Thank you so much, Linda. And Linda is a ballot clerk in Antrim, New Hampshire. We'll come back to supervisor of the checklist. We'll go to Phil with his ward clerk duties.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm a what's called a ward clerk in Dover Ward 3. We have 6 wards in Dover, so the city clerk who's not elected actually, but is an employee of the city, oversees all of these elections in 6 different wards. So we have this clerk position, which really, to be honest, is just the assistant moderator. I do whatever the moderator wants me to do. And you know, when somebody talks about the moderator role, you'll find out there's a lot to be done. But, you know, I help with things like set up in the morning, in particular, the One for All machines that help folks with disabilities to do their voting duties. We have to set that up. And at the end of the night, the big thing is reconciliation. So we work with the moderator to try to make sure the numbers all add up. You know, the number of people voted and the number of votes and the number of overvotes and undervotes and all that. It's quite a complicated task. So help is warranted from the moderator. Also, I help wrangle all the volunteers. We have lots of people helping. Like Olivia said, with what I think of as crowd control or greeters. I mean, trying to get people moving to the correct places in the polling place is actually critically important to make the day go well for everyone. And I just want to stop and echo what Olivia said. It's fun to be an election worker, despite everything you might have heard. In my ward, anyways, people come in, 99.9% of the people come to the polls smiling. Actually, they're happy to be there and participate in our democracy. It's rare that you bump into someone that's grumpy. It does happen, but it's rare. It's just a great civic day, actually. So I would encourage people to get involved. In fact, I started out as a greeter, kind of just informally coming in and helping with the crowd control. And then I went to become a ballot clerk. And, you know, I keep getting promoted, I guess you would say. My story is the moderator actually wants out of the job. So he's trying to train me up so that he can get out of it. And so I'll be running for moderator at the next election. One other thing I should say, the hand counting, we have ballot counting machines in Dover, but, you know, you have to hand count a certain number of ballots that people either made a mistake on somewhere or the ballot just won't be read by the machine. So at the end of the day, really the big one I guess I left out is write-in votes. We have to try to tally the write-in votes. So that's another thing where the moderator needs some assistance to oversee people that are counting all these things by hand. You know, it is a long day, but one thing you can think about is working shifts, depending on how your polling place works. But we often have people coming in for 2-hour shifts or 4-hour shifts or 6-hour shifts. So it's something that you could, you know, if you're not up for the full 12 hours, you might think about working a smaller time frame.
And Bill, I just want to add in that some polling places allow for shift, and some polling places do ask poll workers to be there for the whole day. So that really does vary town to town in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I'm trying to promote shifts because at the end of the day, when we're doing reconciliation, those of us that are elected to the positions, most of us feel like we have to be there most of the day. But I tell you, it's a long day, and then you're trying to total up the numbers and do everything. You know, I think we'd all be better off if we only worked maybe 6 or 8 hour shifts. But I know that's a local policy issue. So I don't think I have much more to say, Olivia, unless there's something you think I missed.
No, I think the next slide is about a moderator who is not able to be with us. Oh, the clerk. So the clerk's role in elections is really important. One of the most important roles. Town clerks and city clerks have slightly different roles based on how big of a community you live in. But they work also to recruit and train poll workers, and they work with the moderator on this duty. They also work, the clerk also can accept voter registrations, and then they hand those to the supervisor of the checklist to enter into the database. The clerk has some responsibility around absentee ballot request forms, mailing out those absentee ballots, posting the sample ballots to the website. They also are the person who accepts all the election supplies from the Secretary of State, and they are the ones that accept and process the candidate filing periods. They double check ballots. The clerks have lots of responsibilities with elections year round, maintaining records and some other duties as well. So I'll go through the moderator role quickly. But if there's anyone on the call who's a moderator, they can correct me if I miss anything. The moderator is the person in charge on election day, and their job in partnership with the Secretary of State's office is to make sure their poll workers are recruited and trained, that all of the material and the polling place is set up, that they are there as the point person for any voter who has a question. They are ensure that the process runs smoothly. They oversee absentee ballot preparation or counting. They work to make sure they're the ones that have the key to the ballot counting device. If the device is full, they empty those devices, and so much more. The duties of the moderator are probably the largest in the book for election workers, and they're elected every 2 years. So any questions, if you make a mistake on your ballot and a ballot needs to be voided, that goes to the moderator. Select people, or selectmen, as our Constitution calls it. This role is actually in the New Hampshire Constitution for Election Day. And they're responsible for selecting the polling place and making sure that it's ADA compliant and has adequate parking lot. They pass the budget for the election. You know, I live in a city and I'm technically a city councilor, so we do that as our city council duties. But cities and selectmen have very similar roles. There are some communities that do elect their selectmen separately, and they are not city councilors. So those roles of budgeting do fall on sort of the governing body. The election procedural manual says select people are responsible for making sure staffing is adequate, but I think that that's a real shared responsibility with the moderator and the clerk. And 2 select people have to be present at the elections all day. In my city, there's 3 select people for our ward, and so we sort of share those duties. And then at the end of the night, our job is to sign off that the elections have been, sign the sealed container at the end of the night. Small communities have slightly different perspectives on their job as a supervisor of the checklist than people who live in larger cities. And in larger cities, like the city of Manchester calls these roles board of registrars. So instead of calling it a supervisor of the checklist. And so really their duty is to register new voters, maintain that the checklist is up to date with their voter information. They send 30-day letters if somebody has moved out of their community, or every 10 years during the process. They also hold public sessions to register new voters. So at a couple of times a year, they have to have a public session. And they also certify after the election, the checklist of who has cast a ballot. And oftentimes they are actually data entering that information after the election. And so this is a job actually that works more than just on election day. It's a job that has a couple of regular days a year where they have to meet. They also use something called the statewide voter registration system, which is a new system that has come into place this year to add voter information. And something I learned from her write-up is that the supervisors of the checklist enter the election results. I always thought that that was the clerk, but I guess I guess it could be one of those shared duties. They also take additional training for a supervisor with the checklist. There are 3 supervisors elected in each town, and they're elected for a 6-year term. So that is the supervisor of the checklist role.
Okay, so the job of a supervisor of the checklist is interesting, and even the name is different. In some states, the person who does the same piece of work as a supervisor in New Hampshire is referred to as a registrar of voters. And in our cities and towns that have multiple wards and voting districts, we have supervisors who might be called members of the Board of Registrars. And the role of the supervisor is actually different from the town clerk, but we work closely with the town clerk. I think in some states there's a overlap of the town clerk work and the registrar work. So in New Hampshire, we have 3 supervisors per ward or voting district, and 2 must be present in order to do any official supervisor business. The cities that have more than 1 voting district or ward have additional supervisors or registrars, but the whole setup varies from city to city. So I can't tell you exactly how that would work in any given city. Supervisors are elected on even numbered years at the town meeting, and they serve for 6 years. So the primary thing that we do is to register new voters. And we do that in 2 ways. We do that on election day, and then we have a non-election day supervisor session process. On election day, the supervisors actually guide the applicants through the process of completing their forms. We review their applications. We review the supporting documentation. We provide affidavits if they need to have them, and we approve the applications. Then we enter that new voter information in the statewide voter registration system, and it's part of our whole processing of the election. For a non-election day supervisor session, whether that's a mandatory session prior to an election or another session that's called by the supervisors to complete the work that we do, the supervisor reviews the voter registration applications that have come from the town clerk that may have been brought to the town clerk's office during the interim period, and verify whether the new registration date has been entered into the system or not. And some of the our town clerk, for instance, generally will enter the information, and we just verify that it's complete and correct. And we approve those registrations or not. I'm using this adjective because of my own experience. In the unlikely event that a resident actually appears at a supervisor session, we go through the whole application process, and so that they can complete the forms right there in front of us. I have, in my experience over 9 years, I think we've had 3 times that an actual person has come to a supervisor session. So it's not common. The supervisors maintain the list for this town or ward, and we're responsible for any updates to the statewide voter registration system. So we add the new voter information. We make changes to the voters' names, addresses, if they change a party affiliation. We verify whether a voter has moved from the district and therefore should be removed from the actual voting district list. And we correct any misspellings or erroneous entries on voter records. And we remove duplicate voters, voters who have died, and voters who've moved out of our district. The supervisors hold public sessions for this registration and update process. And we keep minutes that available to the public if they request them. We make sure that we have redacted or removed any non-public information. And for example, date of birth is one of the pieces of non-public information that can't be presented if somebody wants to look at the minutes and there's something attached about a new voter. The supervisors also certify and post the voter list. And we take training to keep current on election law and any related procedures that have changed. In fact, I have training tomorrow for whatever might have changed since the last time we had an election, which was the primary. We register new voters on the election day, and consequently, we have to then make sure we have at least 2 supervisors at every state primary, general election, presidential primary, local elections, and also at the school, village, or district elections. At the school, village, or district elections, we will sometimes also act as the ballot clerks, as well as doing our supervisor role. And we're responsible for entering the election results into the statewide voter registration after every election. So that's the whole work.
Thank you so much, Susan. So I think that those are most of the roles in the election. So this is a list of communities where we know there are need for additional election workers. So Effingham, New Hampshire, Manchester, New Hampshire, Rochester, Keene, Moulton, Moulton Borough, Lisbon, Nottingham, Wilton. So those are where gaps are for election workers for the September and November elections that we're aware of. And we want to just make sure that other people know if there's anyone from these calls that are on this call that's from any of those towns or have friends in any of those communities, please share the information you've learned tonight about what an election worker is and how important they are to help fill some of those gaps that we're aware of. Also to volunteer, to be an election worker, you want to contact your town or city clerk. Sometimes your town or city clerk will give you the phone number of the moderator, but the town clerk is always a good place to start for volunteering for those election workers. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to put my email in the chat too at the end of the night. I'm also happy to make sure to help navigate you to the right place if you need assistance and are wanting to volunteer for one of those roles. So if you send your contact information to me, I'm happy to send it over to a ward clerk or a moderator. We also know that there are some towns that might say, we're good. We have everybody we need. Linda, can you tell a story about the first time you volunteered? The interim clerk said, we're good. We have everyone.
And I don't remember.
Oh, and you said, oh, put me on the list in case anyone cancels. And she called you like a few days before the election.
Exactly.
And you were a poll worker for the first election you were, and now you're a poll worker every election.
Yeah, and now it seems as though every time when I let her know that I'm available, I get on the list. So I think it's definitely worthwhile to check in with your clerk and see what the needs are.
And some polling places are only open 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., which is the required hours. And that's mostly in very small communities way up north. A lot of communities, some open at 6 or 7 or 8 in the morning. So it is a very, like as Phil said, it is a long day. And also, if you haven't heard from your clerk about their election needs, I think it's okay for you to follow up. I tend to follow up in person my clerk responds better when she sees my face. But some clerks respond better by mail, by email, or by phone call. So just get to know your clerk, and build a relationship with those clerks. As Phil said, he's planning to run for moderator at his next election. And so to do that in towns, clerks, moderators, and supervisors of the checklist and select people all file to run in January 22nd through January 31st next year in 2025 in towns. Cities have a different filing period for those roles, because cities have November elections and not town meetings in March. Okay, now we're going to take the screen down. Somebody has to have a question or a dialogue. Oh, did Tina join us? Sorry. No. Okay. Any questions? Any interest in being a poll worker?
What is it that other states could take from this to help better, from East Coast to the West Coast to make it a lot more simple so that there's no hassle from ballot stuffing or some type of fraud going on?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I want to say that I think New Hampshire has very local control of our elections. So some across the country have county elections.
I live in Concord, and if you have to live where you're, I mean, I would like to help. That's what I was going to say, was that I would love to volunteer, but I wouldn't be surprised if Concord were full up. But I would just reach out to the town clerk to get.
Yes, that's
Get that
probably the best way,
information.
because sometimes they need to have an additional person, especially in the large towns where they're likely to have multiple wards that they have to cover, and if somebody's sick, that can be a difficulty. Especially primary elections are an incredible amount of work and take a lot of hands. And so if you let your clerk know now, and I'm sure she or he would be glad to have that information that they could call on you.
In towns that have multiple wards, do you generally have to volunteer in your own ward?
Yes.
Typically, yes. So what ward you don't have to answer, but I think last year, Ward 5 was looking for people. Also, the ward on the Heights was looking for a greeter who might speak different languages.
I'm in Ward 3, which probably isn't very helpful, but if they need people, I can go hang out at Beaver Meadow. So I'll let the town clerk know.
Yeah, let your town clerk know that you're available. The other thing is they also have they try to have balanced number of Republicans and Democrats that are at the table for the ballot clerk's desk. So often Concord is looking for Republicans to help too. So
Sadly, no. I was independent for 40 years, but I did finally switch to Democrat recently. Could always switch back though, they'll let me. But it would be sad. I want a Democratic ballot. So anyway, is there a job that it's best to start with, or does the clerk sort of tell you what they have available and any volunteer could probably fill any role? I guess that was really part of my question for this.
Yeah, I think Phil might talk about his experience, right? You started as a
Yeah, I mean, I think you could tell them you want to do a particular thing, but generally they'll assign you to where they need you, and-
So I don't need to know what I want to do. I can just say,
No.
I'll do whatever you need.
Yep. Yep. And I think it's a good way to start, is just sort of fill in for lots of different roles and figure out what you want to do and what makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't mind. I can be available all day. I make my own schedule, so I could do whatever.
And
I'm
well,
sure they'd appreciate it.
It's the first year I can say that I can definitely be available all day. So
And while I have the mic, I'm just gonna wave goodbye because I have to sign off for another meeting. It's
thank you
pleasure.
for joining us.
Thank you.
It looks like we have another question from. Go ahead. Who's got your hand raised? Hope you can unmute and ask your question. I still think you might be muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm from California, so ours is probably a little bit different, maybe, but it's mostly the same. Again, Constitution. I want to speak about like the pay. Now, if my governor makes about $234,000 a year, I don't think I'm gonna be paying him the same rate if he decides to volunteer as a poll worker. How would you feel if you have to force to pay the same rate and he's not the governor at that moment? He's just a poll worker. So that's my question.
Well, I can't speak to California because I don't know the rules in California. But I will just speak in New Hampshire generally about the pay of poll workers. Some supervisors of the checklist are paid $9 an hour and some are paid $15 an hour. I think it depends. Each community sort of sets that rate. Susan, or some get a stipend and some don't get paid at
Yes.
all?
We have flat rate that we get every year, but we don't put in for then travel or anything like that. It just, we get the one rate. And we
one.
have a small town, so it's not as if we have to work many days, but it's long hours anyway because of the hand count and all of those things.
And I do think moderators, I also get a flat rate for the day is what I've heard in most communities, they get a flat rate for like a stipend for the day. And it's not a lot. It might be $125 or $150. It's a real small stipend for a 15 or 16-hour day. So it's not, you're not going to get wealthy being an elected poll worker.
We actually get $15, I think now, an hour when we work at a school election. That's the only one that has a separate budget for us.
So the school district pays you a little bit more probably than the town elections.
Yep. Yeah, well, the town just has a flat rate for whatever we do all year.
Mhm. And ballot clerks, some pay them hourly and some pay them the stipend for the day. And I think that varies community by community as well. And one ballot clerk I know waived their fee. They said, I'm a volunteer, I don't need the fee, but they had to sign a paperwork saying that they're sort of waiving their fee. But then I do know in communities like Ware, New Hampshire, a lot of the roles are still all run by volunteer roles. They're not paid. So, I mean, the pay is varied, at least in our communities, town by town. And I will say it's nothing compared to the governor's salary. I think the governor of New Hampshire makes over $100,000. The governor of California makes probably a lot more. So poll workers are not at all on an equal footing as higher up government officials. But I think
Yeah.
what poll workers do is provide that sort of
That
they're
easy
there to
process.
count the ballots, they're there to administer the elections and really be nonpartisan arbitrators of what happens at
Yeah,
your polling place.
to make sure that the voting process is done. Like everybody has that vote.
Yeah.
Matter what skin color they are, matter what background. They come to America, they become citizens, they get that right. And that can't be taken from them. So yeah, learning something new every day from this. And I hope that this election is a lot smoother than the 2021.
Yeah, we all hope that this election runs very smoothly. And that and I think that New Hampshire elections have run smoothly. every election too. I mean, there has been some hiccups. There has been some towns that have made mistakes, but they're human errors.
Yeah, we're not all perfect.
Are
No one's perfect.
resolved.
The system's not perfect. So just like with the domain systems, the county systems, they worked one day, the next day of the election, they didn't work. So it's just like who's pointing the finger. Yeah, as long as we all work as one.
Yeah.
I mean, if
And
let's
I
say
know
school kids could get an election done correctly, how can adults bicker about it and try to get it done?
And I think some communities actually do have mock elections for kids. Some towns don't, but some do have sort of kids voting and kids administering sort of election day. And I love that kind of civic engagement for the day. It's a real wonderful way to do it. I know some communities have like townwide bake sales at election day too. So once people vote, there's like some community celebration, and some towns don't have that. They, you know, if you just
No,
go
like
in,
I
you
said,
vote,
it is a big day. I mean,
yeah. And I will say to your question about machines and testing, in New Hampshire, all ballot counting devices are tested beforehand.
yeah, see, that's what the thing,
Yeah,
they're tested beforehand, and then like the day of, all of a sudden, maybe too much power going through the system. Again, it could be the grid system. Who knows? You know, and then they just start pointing fingers on where did it come from, who made it. I was like, if it's here and we have the process to eliminate it, to make it better, there's no right or wrong answer on that.
Yeah, and I do have my book of 400 pages of election rules that govern elections. So there's lots of, like, some people say, well, why do they do this? And I'm like, well, because that's the law that governs it. So we have our Constitution that sort of is, you know, higher than the election law rules, but this 400 pages of laws are really what the election workers follow to the best of their abilities each election.
Yeah, that's all we could ask was, you know, we could only do as best we can. And, you know, just make sure that the voting process continues to get better, you know, because when the youth, when it's their time to vote, they won't have such a hard time, making sure their ballot gets delivered on time, just like the mail-in ballots. I mean, people that can't get there, that's why when I brought up, you know, like an Uber system or, you know, drop-off person that, you know, go around and pick those up or pick people up to continue to make sure get their voted.
Susan, do you want to add?
I just wanted to mention in case Dr. Estrada didn't know this, that our machines do not go into the internet. They are not online. It's just counting within the building, and it's not connected to anything. There's no count that's going to the Secretary of State's office while things are counting.
No, it's just that machine that's doing the count, right? Like a calculator type thing. There's nothing really going out. It's just being pulled in.
Right.
That's why they
it's
call it
tabulated inside that machine. But
yeah, when I seen those machines, I was like, man, I was all looking at it. Amazing machine. Or, you know, just one little step to just make sure it gets counted. But there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, and I think that there also are humans at the end of the day that look through those ballots.
Error is human.
Yeah, so that, you know, if you haven't filled in the bubble and you put a check mark, you know, the moderators and the election workers are doing that due diligence. So.
Just make sure that, you know, like they say, you cross your T's, you dot your I's, you know, if your name is misspelled, you want to make sure that, you know, your vote gets counted. That's what workers are there for. All workers, that's why they volunteer, you know, they want to make sure that everybody gets that opportunity to get their ballot.
I have emailed my town clerk. Thank you.
Emailed your town clerk. See you right on it.
I'm done. We'll find out.
Well, wonderful. Thank you I'm glad that you have done that, emailed your town clerk. If anyone has additional questions, feel free to email olivia@opendemocracy.me. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us tonight, and we'll have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you.
Bye-bye.